Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. I am your host, Todd Embley, and today I am thrilled to welcome Tom Parker, National CEO of the Australia-China Business Council. Today, we'll hear from Tom about recent developments in Australia-China relations, the prospects for Australian brands in China, as well as his fascinating career path. Tom, welcome to The Negotiation Podcast.
Thanks, Todd. Pleasure to be here.
All right, let's start. Standard opener. What city are you recording this episode from today?
I'm here in Melbourne, in the south of Australia. So, yeah.
All right, nice. Okay, introduce a little bit about the ACBC, the Australia-China Business Council, to the audience for us. Paint a picture of the membership and tell us about the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Todd. So, the Australia-China Business Council, or ACBC, is Australia's premier, bilateral business chamber or organisation that helps Australian businesses better engage and understand with China, as well as assisting Chinese businesses and organisations invest into Australia. We're 50 years old, had our 50th anniversary last year, and were formed 1 year after the normalisation of relationships between Australia and China in 1973. The council is made up of corporate membership, and we have branches in each state and territory across Australia. So I sit over all the branches, and we have a national board, as well as in each of those states, we will have, a local executive committee, as well as an executive team. So we have roughly about 500 plus corporate members, and they're everything from your BHP, your Rio Tintos, your natural resource companies, through to smaller wineries, or even to people doing e-commerce between Australia and China.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now, you can tell me to move on in the questioning if you want, but something you said struck me as interesting, and I don't know how much of a history buff you are around it, but the normalization of relations, 1973. I've never had anybody bring that up before. I'm kind of interested in what that actually is. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about what that meant?
Yeah, so modern China's history after, the fall of the Qing dynasty went into, what you would call a republican era. And that was interspersed with the interwar years. And as many people would know, Japan invaded China in 1937, and roughly around those times, there was a civil war between the Republican and the Communist Party. At the conclusion of the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek and the Republican, party and teams transitioned and moved across to Taiwan and set up there. And in the meantime, China was, on the 1st of October 1949, was established as the People's Republic of China. Through that period, the Republic of China, which was Taiwan, was recognized by the UN and by the US. What had happened in the but during the Cold War, in relation to some of the escalating tensions between Russia and the United States, China, particularly through Zhou Enlai, who was the premier, and to a lesser extent Chairman Mao, and the work that Dr. Henry Kissinger did, by having a tighter and closer relationship with China, it de-escalated the tension between America and China. So when we call a normalization of relationships, what it really meant was that I think it was initially, they called it ping pong diplomacy, but a ping pong team visited America. That started, the conversations in the back alley, not back alleys, the back channels. And through that, I think it was President Nixon that, formalized and normalized the relationship between the United States and China. Australia went to China. Well, the leader of our opposition party went to China in 1971. And then he was elected into government in 1973. And one of his first things that he did was to establish relationships, diplomatic or normalized relationships with the People's Republic of China, which was in 1973, which was just 1 year after the US. And our organization was born 1 year after that, when we took a trade mission, not me, not that old, when our forebears took a trade mission of 16 businesses to China. And the government, our government, the Australian government, felt that there needed to be an auspicing or an organisational body that could be set up to help facilitate trade between the two countries. And that's we're a not-for-profit, independent and non-government aligned business chamber.
I'm so glad that I actually asked that question.
Oh,
And that
good.
was that, and it's great for those who are listening. That was a completely off the cuff. Tom had no idea that was even coming, and then just crushed it. Just knocked it
Oh,
out of the
good.
stadium. So
Well,
thank you
well,
so much
you
for
know,
that.
hopefully it's like, when you see those documentaries and you look stuff up. So maybe people can look all that stuff up, and maybe some of my dates, my times or something. But that's the broad picture. Hopefully I got it right. But yeah, that's
Man,
where it
you're going to
sits.
be narrating BBC specials on this kind of stuff later. That was awesome. Okay, so
No.
over the last year, there seems to have been, and I don't think we're putting words in anybody's mouths by doing this, although we are, a general warming of Australia-China relations, to
Yeah.
say. Okay, so
Yeah.
what's your pulse check on that current state of the bilateral relationship? And
Yeah.
secondarily, what do you think are the factors behind that positive shift?
So absolutely. I mean, to provide a little bit of context for your listeners, Australia and China, I have a really strong, I guess, mutually beneficial economic relationship. So we dig stuff up, we send it, they make it, we buy it back. And certainly our close economic relationship with China certainly helped us stave off some of the issues that a lot of the world had around the financial crisis from subprime, even the Asian economic crisis back in 1997. So we've I guess our engagement and our close links with China economically have been really beneficial for us, and likewise I think for China, and it's a complementarity that I think both countries understand. Um, there had been some tensions politically since about 2018. The Australian government passed a law which was called the Foreign Interference or Transparency Law, and really what it was trying to do was looking at and protecting, I guess, foreign actors or bad state actors involving and engaging in activities that might influence, government or other things. Whilst it wasn't directly targeted at China, I think China certainly felt that it was. And our former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, stupidly quoted Chinese Mandarin in Parliament. And generally, when you do that and you don't speak the language and you don't understand the context, it can cause offence. But he sort of said that Australia had 站起来, which means stood up to China. And that's famously the first line of the Chinese national anthem. It's also what Chairman Mao said on the rostrum of Tiananmen when he declared the opening of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, where he basically said, China has chilad, has stood up. So that started the process. Then another conservative government in Australia questioned and wanted to ask, some thought appropriately, but certainly perhaps not in the diplomatic way or through the diplomatic channels, sort of an investigation into the outbreak of the coronavirus, which again caused great offence. As a result, there became a bit of a tit for tat economic coercion, where I think the market access for some Australian goods and services were restricted through a rules-based
Mm-hmm.
process,
Mm-hmm.
through tariffs. Others were through beliefs that there had been issues with safety and security. And, it caused a huge impact. I think not so much economically, but I think politically as well as culturally between our two countries, who had, I think for a lot of Australians, they had a very benign relationship with China. It was sort of seen as a country that offered, I guess, economic opportunity, as well as friendship. And there wasn't that polarization that we often get from an ideological perspective that sometimes perhaps predates that Cold War process between America and China. Anyway, we had a change of government from a conservative to a Labor government, which is perhaps a bit more like the Democratic Party in the States. And they've traditionally had a better and closer relationship with our Asian neighbours. And I think perhaps what they did is they just went about it in a more pragmatic approach. They really reinstated some of the diplomatic channels and got to work on establishing and rebuilding that relationship. I also think that China also felt that some of the policies they perhaps put in place inadvertently hurt them and their economy as a result. And so there was a sort of a coming to the table. I also think, globally, globalization, there's a lot of proponents and people feel that with a lot of countries, regardless of trade, is a global thing. But, there's been a closing of borders. Someone at a conference just recently said it was a really good point. When we were all locked up in our houses, and in Melbourne, we were in the longest lockdown in the world, pretty much, I think 230 days during COVID, that suspicion kind of crept in, mistrust. And when you can't see each other, when you can't be face to face, and you don't have that dialogue, sort of things fall away. And so I think that was part of it as well. So I think partly was the context. I think partly it was some of the decisions of both the Australian government and the Chinese government. And I think as a result of that, what's come from it is been a change of government. But I also think, both sides have wanted to look at how do you stabilise that relationship. And certainly the Australian government's got a very clear kind of framework, which is sort of work where we can, and disagree where we must. And so it's proved to be, sorry about the noise in the background there. Do you want to just stop here, Liam? And then I'll go and turn my phone off.
An alarm or a phone?
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm back.
Oh gosh, doesn't matter at all.
Yeah. So I think what we've seen has just been kind of an easing off, partly because of the context, but also because of the change of government.
Okay, awesome. As any good interview show does, we tend to follow the heads of state, the major political figures as they travel around the world and then ask about their goings on. And we know that the Australian PM just recently had a state visit to China in November.
Yeah.
What has been any of the outcomes, positive developments in the wake of that visit that you can talk about?
Yeah, well, I think the most important one is that he was there. So it was the first time in 7 years that an Australian Prime Minister had been to China. And also to meet with Xi Jinping. And I think that for a lot of Australian businesses in the broader community, they don't really understand the symbolism of what that actually means. And I think that whilst some of the policies that were put in place by the Chinese government they were registered with the WTO, they were quite clear what they were doing. A lot of it was also just, Australia's on the nose. We don't, from a Chinese perspective, we don't want you to kind of, Australia's in the bad books, so we don't really want you to engage with them. And I think what that means is that businesses and distributors and retailers, what they felt is like, I better not piss off people. So I'm just it's too hard. It's too complicated. If I wanted to, and if you wanted to get red wine, beautiful Australian red wine, you just had to pay a lot of money for it in China. But what it meant was that when this visit happened, it kind of gave a green light to everyone. It's like, hey, the boss says Australia's okay. We're back on. And I think as a result of that, what we've seen, and literally the Australia-China Business Council, our phones and our emails kind of went hot from literally the day after. We had a huge delegation, a vice governor of Zhejiang province come down literally 3 days afterwards with 40 people. And so I think what it created was kind of the approval even though it wasn't said, okay, everyone, you can, it's okay. But what it did symbolize was that there was that opportunity now that we were going to talk again. We were going to find constructive ways to work together and work coherently.
Okay, nice.
Oh, and I think, sorry,
You
the outcome from it
okay?
was also they created something called a joint statement of outcomes, which was looking at a couple of areas that both countries really wanted to focus on. And interestingly, some of those were things like climate change or climate smart agriculture, and some of the tariffs and some of the goods that had issues with market access were going to come off in as a process of that.
Okay. Now you mentioned a nice glass of Australian red wine. What is the status of Australian wine in China?
Yeah, so as of the end of March, there are all the tariffs that had been put on Australian wine have now been lifted. So the pre-tariff prices means that, as I said, wine was still available, but it was just prohibitively expensive. I think the tariffs were over 200%, which makes it very difficult to compete with great Californian or European or South American wine or New Zealand wine. So now that that's there, and I guess trades resuming between the two, but similar to how in a lot of industries that were sort of shut down during COVID, it takes a while to get the wheels turning, to just getting those orders, to getting people back on the grounds, finding those distributors again, and working together. But yeah, no, the wine trade's back on.
Yeah. Well, I just think generally speaking, for Australian businesses and brands, all arrows are pointing up right now, which is awesome.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't mean that even just figuratively up the map. I mean just
yeah.
looking really, really good. So,
Yeah,
what
and
are?
I
Go ahead. Go
think a
ahead.
lot of people talk. Oh, sorry, Todd. I was just going to say I think a lot of people don't realize just how much we export to China. So 40% of the value of all of our exports goes to China, or it was sort of pre-COVID. Um, so there's been a real push to diversification just from a supply chain risk perspective. But that's now down. It got down to just under 30%, about 29% in 2021, and it's now back up around 34-35%.
It, do you know? And I just remember this from years ago, and I haven't looked it up recently, and I mean years like 10 years ago. But is China net exporting or net importing these days?
It's net importing against us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for
And that's really
those,
based off the value of our iron ore.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean I mean you just think about how much the general person on the globe thinks about the output of China.
Yeah.
I think as a nation, you have to realize that they're a net importer,
Yeah.
despite
Yeah.
everything that they make for the entire
Yeah.
globe. That's a
Yeah.
crazy,
Yeah.
crazy fact to think about. Um,
Well,
so
I mean, the other thing too, Todd, is that sort of a third of that value is really one product. It's iron ore. So
yeah,
almost $100 billion worth of trade value that goes to
hmm
China is iron ore that goes into the steel mills that has helped fuel, I guess, the development and the urbanization of China and the growth of their economy, which has helped our economy.
yeah. I mean, China still produces, I think, somewhere 80% or north of rare earth metals, which is kind of key to microchips and all our cell phones and everything like
Yeah,
that. But they are still reliant on a lot of the other components, iron ore being
yeah.
one of them for sure.
Hmm.
Quickly touch on other main growth areas and opportunities for Australian companies in China.
Well, I think it's also partly linked in to iron ore. So, we're as a globe on a pathway to net zero. We have to address climate change. Oh, sorry, to address what's been happening, and as a result, what I think the greatest opportunities that we're looking at is where is that what we call the green channel between Australia and China, which is something that the Australia-China Business Council in 2022 put up, which we felt, given where we weren't really talking to each other, there was still an agreement that we could talk, and similar to the joint outcomes, or the joint statement of outcomes that came from both leaders meeting, was that climate action and action towards decarbonisation is something that both are in both our countries' interests. So how do we make the China's steel industry um, you know emit less, because it's a huge emitter. The dairy cows that go into the milk that goes to China, or the infant formula, livestock, and we have not just dairy, we obviously have beef, which also gets exported to China.
Mm-hmm.
It's the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Australia is livestock. So how do we look at the abatement of those things? So I think where the greatest opportunities might be is we've got this incredible um, technology or kind of innovation where we're harvesting seaweed that we put into cow feed that then stops them farting as much, which means there's less methane, which
Less
means there's
methane.
less
Yeah.
gases.
Perfect.
And something as simple as that, even though it's not simple, it's been, developed, how we export that and how we engage with China's dairy farmers, or how we engage with their consumers, that's where the opportunities are. And so we're seeing some great growth in that space that's not just a transactional relationship, that it's kind of a knowledge sharing and it's a relationship based process. And that's something that we at the ACBC really value and have been doing for a long time from an advocacy perspective, is how do we engage with the consumer in China from an Australian perspective, but also make it more than it's just transactional. But I think there's some opportunities in that particular space. I also think Australia really does well at selling health and happiness, even though I
Mm.
might not look like a picture of either. But the happiness might be the red wine. It could be a nice cut of beef, and
Or
the
both
health is or both. Actually, together they're really good.
at the same time. Yeah.
But then the happiness can also be tourism inbound coming here. I think the health is what we're talking about around some of that the green channel and the green economy opportunities. But I also, it's things like Australian supplements, vitamins, our med tech have also been kind of well received and well regarded. And I think, if anything, I think Chinese consumers have a picture of Australia, even if they haven't visited here, of Australia being kind of abundant in sort of sunshine and health, and sort of outdoors. And obviously, we have our own health challenges, like a lot of Western countries. But I think that while it's a bit hackneyed to kind of keep talking about the clean and green aspect of Australian or even New Zealand products, I still think it resonates in that market, and I think there's opportunities if brands or services fit within those kind of parameters. That's a really easy kind of unique selling point for a lot of Australian brands into China anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you're right. You think about Australia. I mean, it's a mix of mostly Baywatch everywhere, with a mix of Crocodile Dundee and Foster's, but then
Yeah,
a big swath in the middle where they just consistently shoot Mad Max movies.
yeah,
That's
that's
kind of
right.
like that's kind of
Yeah,
what you think
yeah,
about. Um,
yeah, yeah,
let's talk a little bit about consumer brands, because they haven't really been too affected by
not
market
really, no.
access restrictions. So
Yeah.
maybe you could talk about some of the more popular Australian brands that are doing well in China, and then why. I mean, I know that you just touched on the health, and I mean, continuing to kind of unravel why Australian brands resonate so well with the Chinese consumer.
I mean, it's really interesting. I think a lot of it also comes back uh, to people exchange. And by that, what I mean is that um, China was and will be again shortly Australia's sort of leading source of tourists. But the tourists that come are often what we call VFR, which means visiting friends and relatives. So they're visiting their aunties, their uncles, their kids who are at university. and they're staying on average for 27 nights, which is a good stay, as opposed to yes, we get group tours that are here for 48 hours and they do the usual sites and then go onto New Zealand. But the thing that we know with Chinese tourists is that they are by far and above the largest spenders because of the gifting culture of China. And what that means is that they, on average, spend between, again, this is pre-COVID figures, about 7,500 Australian dollars per tourist, which is more than the next three countries combined. And what they're doing is they're buying Australian products. They're buying UGG boots. They're buying sheepskin products. They're buying Swiss or Blackmore's vitamins. They're buying foodstuffs. And what that does is that it then enables those brands to have, I guess, familiarity and in a way almost that grey channel of what was, it's pretty much over the Daigou market or the overseas buyer shopper market. But, for Australia, that was a huge, I think if you look at some of the vitamin companies and even the infant formula companies, they were making so much money off domestic sales that were actually ended up going into parcels, boxes, and being sent back to China. And I think the brands and the opportunities are those that appeal, that then tie into kind of that lifestyle of Australia and also the products that you don't quite see. So whether it's a cereal brand, whether it's a type of biscuit, whether it's if it's a type of beverage or a tea, there are lots of things. We had a lavender bear that went bananas. Like it was a bear that was made of excess lavender that was stuffed, and people travel to Tasmania of all places, which is a lovely spot to visit, but hard to get to buy these bears, Bobby the bear, and again, it was partly through, I guess, that interconnectivity of, and in the example of Bobby the bear, it was happenstance. It wasn't a targeted strategic kind of online campaign, but it was done through through I don't think it was WeChat. It might have been a Xiaohongshu or one of the other platforms posts that then everyone, and the person was a girlfriend of a famous director, and that then led to everyone wanting to buy Bobby the Bear. So there's that sort of connectivity, and I think also for a lot of people, perhaps in the States, there are large overseas Chinese populations in, say, San Francisco or the Bay Area or LA and certainly New York. But, Australia, we have 5% of our population is identifies as having Chinese heritage. Now, that's not all from mainland China. That's Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, those sorts of places. But,
Yeah.
I used to do a lot of work where you said if there's 1.4 million Chinese Australians plus about 1.4 million coming in as tourists and plus 300,000 as students, you're looking at a market that's bigger than some of our states and territories that you can focus into and sell to in that way. So I think what a lot of Australian brands did well was they didn't even realize they were big in China because they were being sold and bought in Australian retail or supermarket or grocery spaces, but then were then also taken back through that. So I think the way within which to kind of connect into, and obviously WPIC, who's an ACBC member and does a lot of great work in that sort of space, can help some of those brands better engage and better understand how to tidy up and take advantage of some of that knowledge and I guess the interest that Chinese consumers might have for Australian brands.
Okay. Tom, very, very busy guy. I know that we're pretty much out of time, that you've got to run. We are super thankful and grateful and blessed to have gotten this time with you that we have had today. I had a bunch of questions left. I'm going to wrap up a couple into one final question, and knowing that we're up against the clock, you can answer that as briefly as you need to.
Sure.
You're based in Australia. So what is the sentiment among the Australian business community towards China? And then, the message and the work that the ACBC is delivering in Australia to work with that kind of sentiment and message.
Yeah. So I think Australian businesses have pragmatic optimism when it comes to China. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think in the past, there was probably some unjustified, rampant optimism. And I think Australian businesses now are, without being risk averse, are kind of more aware of what some of the risks, and how best to engage. I think the big selling stories, or the big opportunities for a lot of Australian brands, is understanding that there's no single pathway. It's not a it's quite complex. You need a series of good advisors, or people in part of your team, and part of your broader team, that can help you engage with that. And certainly, at ACBC, we're here to support those Australian businesses. We don't do that. We don't do consultancy work, but we can put you in touch with our members that do that sort of work. And I think what we're looking at is, just being kind of clear-eyed in terms of what the opportunities are. The mining giants, they're giants and they know what they're doing. They've got great teams. Our big wine companies have got teams on the ground up there. They're doing great stuff. For those that are perhaps looking at re-entering China, or thinking about China, I think, again, it's important to read, to engage, to listen to podcasts like this, to come along to ACBC events, and just try and understand, really what the opportunities are, because it's a great place to do business. And I think that, as I said right at the outset, Australia and China do have a strong kind of relationship, economically, and I think there's been a growing sense of optimism through the kind of warming of the relationships in this kind of stabilization phase.
Yeah, it's quite the hike to enter China, but with a
Yeah,
good Sherpa like the ACBC, it's definitely
yeah,
worth the view. So
yeah,
go for it.
that's true.
Uh,
Yeah,
Tom Parker, National CEO of the Australia China Business Council, thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate your time today.
thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Oh, okay, for everybody listening to audio only, don't forget to go over to the WPIC YouTube channel and check out our shorts and other information over there. For those of you watching on YouTube, don't forget you can catch the podcast in audio form only on all your favorite podcast platforms. But for me and everybody else at the WPIC team, and for Tom Parker, thank you very much for listening today, and we'll see you next time. All right, we are good there.